Okay, welcome back. Hello. Um, Last time we started our unit on the philosophy of sex, and we saw that the main thing we're going to be talking about in this unit is the ethics of sex, right? It's not the only thing, but it is the main thing that we're going to be talking about. The question of what makes a sexual act right or wrong. And we saw that we can subdivide this to ask what makes a sexual act permissible, impermissible, or obligatory, if there's such a thing as an obligatory sexual act. Now, today we're going to start our first topic under this second unit, which is the topic of sexual perversion. If you read the paper by Sobel and Helwani, which I really hope you have read, since you were supposed to read it for the last lecture, you know that to say that an act is perverted, to say that a sexual act is perverted, is to say that it is in some way a distortion of nature. Okay, this is the way that people thought about many sexual acts until pretty recently, and it's the way that some people still think about some sexual acts now. So we're going to see how the concept of sexual perversion is handled, how it's thought about in the medieval period in the work of Thomas Aquinas, who we've already talked about at some length. And you'll see that we're going to spend some time in the next lecture talking about the way that he understands this and whether it still makes sense in our day. Right? Does it still make sense to talk about sexual acts being distortions of nature or being against nature? Or is this a way of thinking about sexual acts that we now have to abandon? Okay, so here's what we're going to do for today. We are once again in the medieval Christian context, right? Thomas Aquinas, who we're talking about, is a medieval Christian philosopher. And so I want to tell you a little bit more about the medieval Christian context than what I told you a few lectures ago. So first, we'll talk about medieval science, okay, how people in the medieval period understood natural science, how they understood the study of the natural world, which is going to be important for understanding how they thought about the human sexual instinct. Then we're going to talk about what in Christianity, and in particular in medieval Christianity, were called the sacraments, which I'll explain in a bit. And then we'll talk a little bit about Christian morality in general, and specifically about the concept of sin that you find in Christian morality. After that, we're going to move on to our reading for this topic, which is the treatise on the cardinal virtues by Aquinas. Okay, so I'll give you a little bit of background on the treatise of the cardinal virtues, just a little bit, so you understand, what a cardinal virtue is. And then we're going to move on to what Aquinas says about the nature of the sexual instinct, okay, the nature of the sex drive in human beings. So most of what Aquinas has to say here is about metaphysics, right? It's about the metaphysics of sexuality, what the sexual instinct is, and what it's like. Though, as we'll see, these metaphysical questions about what the sexual instinct is are very relevant in Aquinas to the ethics of sexuality, right? To what kinds of sexual acts are right or wrong, or to be more specific in the way that we saw last time, which ones are permissible, which ones are impermissible, and which ones, if any, are obligatory. Okay, so today we're mostly going to talk about the first excerpt I had you read from Aquinas. We'll get a little bit into the second, but then next time we're going to focus on the second one. And that's where the concept of sexual perversion is going to come in. Okay, so I really want to stress, nothing that we talk about today will relate to the concept of sexual perversion, or at least not directly. And we're going to talk about Christian sexual morality. We're going to talk about the concept of sin and two different kinds of sin, mortal sin and venial sin, but we're not going to talk about sexual perversion. So everything I'm going to tell you about today is just there to lay the groundwork for what Aquinas says about sexual perversion in the second excerpt that I had you read. All right. So first, the medieval Christian context. So again, we're in the Middle Ages. We're pretty close to the end of the Middle Ages, around the year 1250. That's where Thomas wrote. But it's worth stressing the ideas that he's formalizing, the ideas that he's making more explicit, more precise, were around since the beginning of Christianity. And, they're still around now, right? The way that Aquinas thinks of this is still the way that a lot of Christians think about this in the present day, in the year 2025. Right? If you know Christians, especially if you know Roman Catholics now, if they know their theology well, they still think the way that Aquinas thinks. Okay, so let's talk about the medieval Christian context then. I told you that I'd start with medieval science. So here is some stuff about medieval science, how in the medieval period people understood natural science, how they understood the study of the natural world. Now, as we've already seen, Christian philosophy during the Middle Ages, especially during like the end of the Middle Ages, from the year 1000 or so onward, was very Aristotelian. Okay, very, very strongly influenced by Aristotle. I've already told you that Thomas Aquinas was an Aristotelian, right? He was an Aristotelian philosopher. He didn't accept everything that Aristotle said, right? He was a Christian. He had to modify some things because Aristotle was an ancient Greek. He had a very different understanding of the divine. He had a very different understanding of all kinds of things. But generally speaking, Thomas Aquinas is an Aristotelian. He accepts Aristotle's view of the world. And Aristotle distinguished between what's called the four causes. Okay, so Aristotle thought that you could distinguish between four senses of being a cause of something. Right? So these are four different answers to the question, why does this thing exist? Okay, the four causes are four different answers to the question, why does this thing, whatever thing you're thinking about, exist? Aristotle said, if you want to answer the question, why does something exist? Well, there's four things you can answer. You can point to its material cause. You can point to its formal cause. You can point to its efficient cause, or you can point to its final cause. Okay, I'm going to explain each of these. A material cause is simply what the thing in question is made of, right? The material that it's made of. That's its material cause. So if you ask, why does this bench exist? Well, one answer is, well, because the wood that it's made of exists, right? That's its material cause. The wood that it's made of is the bench's material cause. But then another answer to the question, why does this bench exist, is its formal cause. Okay, that's the second of the four causes, the formal cause. And the formal cause is simply the form, or if you prefer, the shape, the organization. Okay, the organization is probably the best way to think about it, of the material. Right? The way that the material is organized is the formal cause. So again, if you answer the question, why does this bench exist? One answer can be, well, because this particular wood was shaped, was fashioned in this particular way. Right? If the same wood had just stayed in the form of a tree, well, it wouldn't have been a bench. The bench exists because this wood was formed in this particular way, was shaped, was worked into this particular way. Okay, so that's the second kind of cause. There's the material cause, which is the matter that something is made of. There's the formal cause, which is the way that that matter is shaped. But then Aristotle says there's also the efficient cause. The efficient cause is the force or the agent, right, that shaped the material in that way. Whatever it is that shaped the material in that particular way is the efficient cause. So again, if you ask, why does this bench exist? You point to a bench. Why does this bench exist? One possible answer is, well, a carpenter shaped or worked the wood into this particular form. Right? So the carpenter is the efficient cause of the bench. And then finally, Aristotle thinks, in addition to the material cause, which is the matter something's made of, the formal cause, which is the shape it takes or the way it's organized into something, and the efficient cause, which is the force or the agent that makes it or that shapes it in that way, there's also a final cause. And the final cause is the purpose for which it was shaped in that way. Okay, so again, if we take our example of the bench, the final cause of the bench is to have a place to sit. Okay, it is the purpose for which the carpenter shaped the wood in that way. That is the final cause of the bench. It is its purpose. To go back to a word we've talked about a few times, it is its telos. Okay, the telos of the bench, the purpose, the aim, the function of the bench is to have a place to sit. So the final cause of any object is its telos. It is its purpose, its aim, its function. These are the four causes that you find in Aristotle. What's important is Aristotle thought that all entities had all four causes. Okay, not just artifacts. An artifact is a human-made object. Clearly, all artifacts have all four causes, right? My bookshelf has all four causes. It's made of wood, it's shaped in a particular way, somebody shaped it that way, and its purpose is to hold books. My mug is made out of ceramic. It is shaped in a particular way so that it can hold liquid. It was made that way by somebody, and it was made that way for some purpose so that I can drink my tea out of or my coffee out of, right? Clearly, artifacts have all four causes. But Aristotle thought that all entities had all four causes, including natural entities. Okay, remember, Aristotle thinks that every natural being, be it a plant or a squirrel or a human being, has a purpose, right? Has an internal telos. There's an aim to which it tends, which is its final cause. And so Aristotle thinks that every single entity you can think of has all four of these causes, okay, including, again, natural entities. So let's take an obvious example. Aristotle thinks that the heart has all four of these causes, right? The human heart, the organ. The material cause of the heart is, well, whatever tissue it's made of, right? Whatever makes up the heart is its material cause. Its formal cause is whatever organizes the tissue in this way, right? Whatever organizes the tissue into valves and arteries and atriums and whatever, all the different parts of the heart that you learned in high school. That is the formal cause, right? The way that the matter is organized. The efficient cause is going to be the developmental process that organized the matter in this way, right? The process by which, in the womb and until the end of your childhood or so, your heart was organized in the way that it's organized now. That's the efficient cause. That's the process by which the matter was organized in this way. And then finally, the final cause is the purpose of the heart, which is, Aristotle would say, to pump blood. Right? So the heart, the matter that makes up the heart, the material cause, was organized in the way that it is, the formal cause, by a developmental process, the efficient cause, in order to pump blood in your body, which is its final cause. Okay, so Aristotle thinks that properly understanding any object requires understanding all four of these causes. You don't understand something if you don't understand what it's made of, how it's organized, how it was organized in that way, and why, right? For what purpose? And in the medieval period, just about everybody agreed. Just about everybody thought that natural science, understanding the natural world, involved understanding all four causes of some natural object or of natural objects, right? You only understand a fish if you understand not only what it's made of, how what it's made of is organized to make a fish, how that developmental process works, but also why, right? What is the purpose of the fish? What is the purpose of each of its organs? And so on and so forth. Okay, so natural science was thought to include the study of purposes. This is crucial. In the modern period, the main thing that happens in science is that we stop thinking this. Okay, we kind of abandon the study of purposes. To a large degree, we just think things don't have purposes. Okay, but in the medieval period, people thought that there were purposes out there in things. And understanding the natural world, understanding objects in the natural world, involved understanding their purposes. So science, natural science, the study of the natural world, included the study of teleology, okay, included the study of the telos of natural entities. They thought that there were objective aims or purposes in things, and that understanding them involved understanding those aims or purposes. Now, of course, in the medieval period, again, the medieval period is overwhelmingly Christian. The idea was that these purposes are put there purposely by God. Okay, and so understanding any natural entity It involves understanding the purpose for which it was put there by God. Okay, so that's the first thing I want to tell you about the medieval Christian context. Now let's move on to the second, which has to do with what's called the sacraments. Okay, sacraments are just particularly important ceremonial actions in the Christian life. Now you can think of them as very important milestones. Now, different Christian denominations, okay, so different versions of Christianity that exist now, have different numbers of sacraments. So this can differ from one Christian to the next. But in Catholicism, which was the kind of Christianity that was the most widespread in Europe in the Middle Ages, I mean, it's the only one really that was present in Europe in the Middle Ages, there are 7 sacraments. Okay, there are 7 of these milestones that are particularly important in the Christian life. The first was baptism. Okay, that's when you immerse a baby in water in order to initiate the baby into the Christian community. There's confirmation, which is when usually in the early teens, a child confirms that they want to belong to the Christian faith. There's the Eucharist, which is when you take the communion wafer at Mass during a church service. Reconciliation, which is when you go to a priest and confess all your sins. Anointing of the sick, marriage, and holy orders, which I'm not going to define. What's important to understand about the sacraments, about these particularly important milestones, is that they're understood to be, this is a quote from Augustine, the great Christian philosopher Augustine, they're supposed to be visible signs of invisible grace. Okay, grace, God's grace, is simply his undeserved favor to us. You know, if you think about it in terms of what we've already seen, it's his undeserved love for us. Okay, and what he does out of that undeserved love for us. And these sacraments, right, baptism, communion, confirmation, marriage, and so on and so forth, are supposed to be visible signs, right, things that you can see that are signs of an invisible grace. Right? They're just physical signs of something that God is doing for us out of his love for us. So just to understand why this is so important, this means that when you get baptized, right, when a Christian baby gets baptized, what you see is that a baby is immersed in water. Okay, that's the visible sign, and that a priest, says some prayers over the baby. That's what you can see. What you can't see, the invisible work that's being done by God, is that God is introducing that child, is initiating that child into the community of his children. Okay, so the idea is the part of it that you see is simply a sign, a way for us to encounter God's work that is not being seen. Okay, so what is really happening when you get baptized is that God is doing something, not that the priest is doing something. God is doing something. Similarly, when you go to reconciliation, which is where you confess your sins, and the priest tells you you're forgiven, what you see is that a priest tells you you're forgiven. But what is really happening is that God is forgiving you. Okay, God has given the priest the power to forgive you under certain circumstances. And so what is really happening is that God is doing something. This is crucial. Okay, this is what makes the sacraments so important. Sure, you've got a priest who's doing something. He immerses a baby in water, or he gives you a wafer, or he marries you, or he says that you're forgiven, or whatever. But that's just the visible sign. What is really happening is that God is doing something. Okay, God has given the priest the authority to do certain things in his name. And so what's really happening, the important thing that's happening, is what God is doing. And the point I want to make here that's going to be crucial to understanding how Aquinas understands the institution of marriage, but also how the institution of marriage changes, how our understanding of the institution of marriage changes in the modern period, is that marriage is a sacrament. Okay, marriage, although it's done in a church with a priest, and the priest says some words and that kind of thing, what is really happening is that God is doing something. Okay, the ceremony of marriage is simply the visible sign for us, because we're physical creatures who need to see that in person. But what is really happening is that God is creating a bond. Right? God is uniting two people. that's the sense in which Christians will say that marriage is a sacred bond, right? When Christians talk about the sanctity of marriage, when they talk about marriage as a sacred bond, that's what they're talking about. Right? It's a bond that is created by God. It's not created by the priest. God has given the priest the authority to create some sacred bonds in his name. But what's happening there is that God is creating the bond. Um, Now, in the Christian tradition, or at least in the Catholic tradition, okay, the Roman Catholic tradition, Roman Christianity, which again is the kind of Christianity that was, widespread in the Middle Ages, um, God hasn't given the priest the power to undo marriages. He's only given the priest the power to do or to create marriages, right? When the priest says, "Okay, you're married," God goes, "Okay, well, I've given you that authority, and so now I'm going to unite these people." But God hasn't given the priest the authority to undo marriages. And so, for this reason, in the medieval period, there's no such thing as divorce, right? There's no such thing as divorce because that power is not in human hands. A human being cannot. Like the priest could say, "Okay, you're divorced," but that wouldn't count for anything. He didn't create the bond, God did. Um, and God doesn't allow him to undo that bond, or God doesn't undo that bond. And so this is important that you'll see as we go through the different periods of history, as we get into the modern period, the understanding of marriage changes. It starts to be understood increasingly as a contract, right? A voluntary agreement between two people where they say, "Okay, I'm going to uphold my end, you're going to uphold your end, and if you don't, I'm getting out of the deal," right? I'm canceling the contract. But in the medieval period, this is not how marriage is understood at all. It is not in your power as a husband or a wife to get out of the agreement you've made because it's not an agreement. It's something that God has created, right? You have no power over that. And so you'll see, and I'll try to make sure to highlight this as we go forward, our understanding of marriage changes. Okay, that's the second thing. Now let's move on to the third point I want to make about the medieval Christian context, which is about the concept of sin. Now, in Christian morality, you will usually talk about the concept of sin. But in medieval Christianity and in Roman Catholicism, so Roman Christianity more generally, to this day, there's a distinction between two different kinds of sin, okay, two different categories of sin. There's mortal sin and there's venial sin. In pop culture, sometimes we'll talk about the seven deadly sins, right? Deadly is a synonym for mortal. What we're talking about is the seven mortal sins. Okay, there's two different kinds of sins in Catholic Christianity. There's mortal sin and there's venial sin. Now, a sin, I should define this concept. A sin is simply an immoral action. Okay, an action that is, to use the terms we introduced last time, impermissible. That's what a sin is. It's an action that is impermissible. But within Christianity, or at least within medieval Christianity, within Roman Catholicism, it's understood that what makes an action immoral is that it transgresses divine law, right? It violates divine law. It violates God's law. And so a sin is an action that is immoral because it violates God's law. It's an action that is impermissible because it violates God's law. That's what a sin is. Now, again, within medieval Christianity and again within Catholicism to this day, right? Catholics now, if you know any Catholics, they still believe this. They still think in these terms. We'll distinguish between two different categories of sin, right? So two different categories of immoral actions that are understood as transgressing or violating God's law. There's mortal sins and there's venial sins. And a mortal sin is simply a sin that severs your relationship with God. It's a sin that is so bad that it cuts off your relationship with God. In contrast, a venial sin is a sin that is bad, but not very bad. Okay, so it's a sin that merely damages your relationship with God. Now, you might be wondering, what does this mean concretely? Well, concretely, there's a whole story here. Okay, so if you've committed a mortal sin and then you die without going to confession, right? So without going to confess your sins to a priest, and the priest tells you, okay, well, do this and this and this, and then you'll be forgiven. If you commit a mortal sin and then you die without having been forgiven, well, you go to hell. You go to hell because you've got on your soul, on your conscience, a sin that is that bad. Whereas if you merely commit a venial sin and you die before confessing your sins to a priest and then doing penance, right, doing the things that he tells you to do in order to be forgiven by God, then you simply go to purgatory. Okay, so that's a place that's like in between heaven and hell, where your soul is purged, right? That's where the term purgatory comes from, where your soul is purged or cleansed of its sin before going to heaven. Okay, so this is a serious difference, right? A mortal sin, it's a deadly sin because it's very, very bad, right? It will send you straight to hell if you die with it still on your conscience. Whereas a venial sin, it's bad, but it's not so bad that you can't get to heaven. If you die before you have it forgiven, well, you're going to spend some time in purgatory where your soul is going to be purged and cleansed, but eventually you're going to get to heaven. Now, one thing that's very important to go forward is that in the Catholic perspective, or from the Catholic perspective, lust is always sinful. Now, wait a minute. This might sound crazy to you because when we talk about lust, we usually mean sexual desire. This is not what Christians mean by this term, or at least medieval Christians. Okay, this is like a translation issue. When you read medieval Christian texts, actually, when you read the Bible itself, when you see the word lust, it usually does not mean what we mean by the term lust. When we talk about the term lust, like in 21st century English, we usually mean sexual desire, right? To feel lust is to feel sexual desire. That is not the sense. Okay, this is so crucial. Note this down. This is not what the word lust means when you encounter it in the Bible or when you encounter it in medieval Christian texts. What they mean is acting on sexual desire. Okay, so if I just feel sexual desire and I don't act on it, the word for that desire in the Christian tradition is concupiscence. Okay, what I feel is concupiscence. If I don't act on it, I don't commit an act of lust. If I feel concupiscence, i.e., sexual desire, and I do act on it, now I'm committing an act of lust. Okay? So again, just to make sure this is nice and clear for you, concupiscence is the word for sexual desire. When you read Aquinas, when you read the Bible, when you read big Christian figures like Augustine, and they use the word concupiscence, they're talking about desire in general, right? So your desire for the pleasure of eating or the pleasure of drinking or these kinds of things, this is still concupiscence. They're talking about desire in general. And often they're specifically talking about sexual desire. When they use the word lust, they're talking specifically about acting on sexual desire. So doing something out of a desire for sexual pleasure. So masturbating or engaging in sexual intercourse or whatever, that's lust. Okay, that's an act of lust. Now, what I was saying is, in the Christian context, or in the Catholic context, the medieval Christian context, lust, meaning acting on sexual desire, so engaging in some kind of sexual activity for the sake of sexual pleasure, was thought always to be sinful. Okay? It's always sinful to have sex for the sake of sexual pleasure, right? Out of a desire for sexual pleasure. But what's important is, within marriage, lust was merely a venial sin, whereas outside of marriage, lust is a mortal sin. Okay, I'm going to explain much more of this when we get to Aquinas, but here again, I'm just giving you the background to understand, what Aquinas is talking about. Because if you live in the modern period, if you live now, especially if you're not a Christian, though really, even if you're a Christian but not a Catholic, this might seem very strange to you. Okay, this is not really how we think about sex, how most of us think about sex now. And so it's important to give you this context to help you understand. Okay, with that context out of the way, let's talk about Aquinas. Let's talk about, again, the part of the Summa Theologica that is called the Treatise on the Cardinal Virtues. So the first thing I should do here is probably to explain what a cardinal virtue is. So here is a little bit about that. The cardinal virtues are a subset of the natural virtues that were thought especially in medieval Christianity, but actually also in ancient Greece, to be necessary to develop all of the others. Okay, so we saw a couple lectures ago that Aquinas distinguishes between the natural virtues and the theological virtues. Okay, and I explained to you that theological virtues are virtues that have to do with God, right? That's what makes them theological, but also that have to be infused in us by God. And so the theological virtues, as we saw, are supernatural in origin, right? We saw that Aquinas thinks that the virtue of caritas, of agape, of charity, this virtue that consists in loving even our enemies, complete strangers, whatever, people who are neither pleasant nor useful nor virtuous. This virtue is supernatural in origin, right? Aquinas thinks that a mere natural being that is concerned with its own good could never develop that virtue. It has to be given to us by God. Now, the other side of that is that there are natural virtues. These are the kinds of virtues that Aristotle was concerned with, and that can be developed by a natural being. Okay, so the natural virtues are simply those virtues that arise from applying reason, our natural power of reason, to our natural desires and our emotions. Okay, that's what a natural virtue is, right? These are virtues like courage and temperance and so on and so forth that we've talked about with Aristotle. Now, within that division, right? So if you think about it as a division, you've got the theological or supernatural virtues on one end, and then natural virtues on the other. Aquinas thinks, and medieval Christians more generally, and even ancient Greeks thought that within the natural virtues, there were a few that were particularly important. Okay? The word cardinal there comes from the Latin word for a hinge, right? Like the hinge on a door. These are the virtues that all the other natural virtues hinged on. These were the ones that were important for being able to develop all the others, that were necessary for being able to develop all the others. So I've got a list here. Okay, the four cardinal virtues, these four virtues that were thought to be the most important of all, out of all the natural virtues, these are the most important of all, were temperance, right? So moderation in your desire for pleasure and your pursuit of pleasure. That's what temperance is. Prudence, which is wisdom in acting such that it's in your long-term good, right? That's what acting prudentially is to act in your long-term good as opposed to sacrificing your long-term good for immediate present pleasure. Justice, which is giving everybody what's due to them, right? So fairness. And fortitude, which is in other words courage, like doing the right thing even if it's difficult, even if it's scary, and so on and so forth. So the four cardinal virtues were temperance, prudence, justice, and fortitude. People in the medieval period, but also in ancient Greece, thought that these four virtues were particularly important. These four virtues were the ones that allowed you to develop all the others. The reason I explain this is simply, while we're reading a part of the Summa Theologica that is called the treatise on the cardinal virtues, okay, or in the translation you're reading, simply on the cardinal virtues. So it's part of the Summa Theologica that's about these four virtues. And specifically, we're reading part of the Summa Theologica that is about the virtue of temperance. Okay, so what Aquinas has to say about the human sexual impulse and the conditions under which it's okay to act or permissible to act on the human sexual impulse comes in his discussion of the virtue of temperance, right? In his discussion of the virtue of moderation in the pursuit of pleasure, right? What is the correct amount? What is the correct kind of attitude or the correct kind of behavior to take with regard to the pursuit of pleasure? Okay, that's where his discussion, the stuff that you read for today, is located. It's in the part of the Summa that's about temperance. Now, let's talk about what Aquinas has to say about the sexual instinct. Here, we're going to talk about metaphysics, right? This is what Aquinas has to say about the metaphysics of sexuality, about what the human sexual instinct is and what it is like. If you recall our definition of metaphysics from all the way at the beginning of the class. So the first question that Aquinas asked that I got you to read is, are all sexual acts sinful? Okay, remember, a sin in the Christian context is an action that is impermissible and that is understood to be impermissible because it violates God's law, right? That's what a sin is. And Aquinas' question is, are all sexual acts sinful? Is it always sinful to perform a sexual act? And he's going to say no. He answers that no, it is not the case that all sexual acts are sinful. But what I want to highlight is that the reasons for which not all sexual acts are sinful have to do with his understanding of the nature of the human sexual impulse. Okay, it has to do with his understanding of what the human sexual impulse is, and what it's like. Okay, so here's what he says. Here's a quote, a long quote, sorry. He says, I answer that a sin in human acts is that which is against the order of reason. Okay, so as I've already told you, a sin is something that is immoral. It's something that violates God's law. And Aquinas understands that to mean that there is a reasonable order in the world, right? The world is ordered rationally. It has been ordered rationally by God, right? Who is a rational being. God has placed a certain order in the world. And human beings who are made in the image of God, and so who have reason, are able to perceive that order. Okay, so there's an order of reason in the world that was placed there by God that we're able to perceive. And something is sinful when it is against the order of reason. Now, he says, the order of reason consists in its ordering everything to its end in a fitting manner. In other words, right, this is why I told you about medieval science. In other words, all natural things have an end, right? They have a goal or a function, a purpose, a telos, right? That word end there, if this were a Greek text, would be the word telos. The order of reason consists in ordering everything to its natural telos in a fitting manner, to its natural purpose, its natural function. So what it is to follow the order of reason is to use things in or according to their aim or their purpose or their function. Now, it is no sin, Aquinas says, if one, by the dictate of reason, makes use of certain things in a fitting manner and order for the end to which they are adapted, provided this end be truly good. Okay, so it is never a sin, Aquinas is saying, to use things for the purpose for which they were intended, provided that that purpose is really good. Now, of course, the purpose of natural entities, right, the telos of natural entities, is always good because it was placed there by a God who is always good, and a God who is all good. Remember, in the Christian tradition, God is understood to be omnibenevolent, all good, omnipotent, all powerful, and omniscient, all knowing, right? So God is all good. So the ends that he put, the purposes or the aims or the functions that he put into the world are always good, of course. And so it's never a sin to use things according to the purposes that God put in them. Okay, that is Aquinas' claim here. That's never a sin. Now, he says, just as the preservation of the bodily nature of one individual is a true good, so too is the preservation of the nature of the human species a very great good. Okay, so just as it's good for you to survive, it's good for the human species to survive. And, he adds, just as the use of food is directed to the preservation of life in the individual, so the use of sexual acts is directed to the preservation of the whole human race. And so here you have the idea that the human sexual impulse has a function, right? Just like everything else in nature, as we saw in the medieval period, everybody thinks that every natural entity, to understand it, requires understanding its four causes, meaning that every natural entity must have four causes, right? It must have a material cause, must have an efficient cause, must have a formal cause, and also it must have a final cause. It must have a telos, it must have a purpose, an aim, a goal. And the purpose or the aim or the goal of the human sexual instinct is to reproduce. That's why God gave it to us, right? That's why we have sexual organs. on Aquinas's understanding of things in order to reproduce. And it is good for us to reproduce because it's good to maintain the human species, right? And that's what reproduction does. So you see here that you have a kind of normative ethical theory, right? In our last lecture, in the introduction to this unit, we talked about different normative ethical theories, different theories about what makes an action right or wrong, different theories about the standards of right and wrong action. And we saw that one popular theory, especially in the Middle Ages, or I should say, especially before the modern period, is natural law theory. It's the idea that there are moral laws, there is a moral order placed in the nature of things. Usually, the people who believed this in the Middle Ages, of course, were religious. And to this day, usually, people who are natural law theorists are religious. Right? They think that there is a natural order in things. Right? There's an order that is in the nature of things that was placed there by an all-good God. And so you find in Aquinas a kind of natural law theory, right? He's saying there is an order that's just out there. It's there in things. We can discover it by observing how things function, right? It's a rational order and we're rational beings and we're able to perceive it. And to use things in accordance with their purpose, as long as it's good, and of course, if it was put there by God, it is good, is never sinful. And the human sexual instinct was put there by God for a purpose that is good, to reproduce. And so to use it to reproduce is never sinful. Okay? So I just want to stress here, this means that sexual acts, by virtue of the fact that they have an end, right? By virtue of the fact that they have a built-in aim or purpose or goal, a built-in telos, they've got a natural object, right? They're naturally aimed, Aquinas thinks, at a particular object, which is a person of the opposite sex, right? Because that's the kind of person you can reproduce with. So from the perspective of medieval Christianity, from the perspective of Aquinas, your sex drive, right, your sexual faculty has a built-in purpose or a built-in aim, which is to reproduce. That's what it's there for. And because it has that particular aim, it has a built-in object, right? There isn't, just as when we talked about the philosophy of love, we said that we asked about the object of love, right? What it's aimed at. In a similar way, Aquinas thinks that there's an object built into the sexual faculties, which is a person of the opposite sex, or actually more specifically, the genital organs or the reproductive organs of a person of the opposite sex. That's what your sexual organs are naturally ordered toward. Okay? It's toward reproducing with a person of the opposite sex through genital contact. That's what we have them for. Okay, so just to bring this home, in Aquinas' view, remember, in Aquinas' view, every natural entity, including every organ in your body, has a material cause, an efficient cause, a formal cause, and a final cause. And so if you look at your reproductive organs, the material cause of your reproductive organs are the tissues that they're made of, right? Whatever material they're made of. The formal cause of your reproductive organs are whatever ways those tissues are organized in order to form a penis or a vagina, right? That's what the formal cause is the way those tissues are organized. The efficient cause is the developmental process by which, from conception onward, your organs were developed, your organs formed in the way that they are. And then the final cause, right, the purpose for which you as a mammal have those organs is reproduction. So from a medieval Christian context, from the perspective of Aquinas' philosophy, there is a purpose in your reproductive organs that is just as objective as the matter they're made of, the way that matter is organized, or the developmental process by which they came to be. That's why you have those organs. That's what those organs are for. That is just an objective part of what they are. And again, as part of what they are, they have a built-in aim, right? A purpose, a telos, a function, and a built-in object, a kind of thing that they're directed toward. So this is, again, I want to stress, the metaphysics of the sexual instinct according to Aquinas. Right? He's asking a moral question. He's asking, is every sexual act a sin? In other words, is every sexual act impermissible? And he's answering no. And his answer to that question depends on a particular metaphysics of the human sexual instinct, right? Understanding what the human sexual instinct is. And according to Aquinas, the human sexual instinct is to reproduce, right? It is a drive to reproduce. And so it has a particular aim or function, which is, again, reproduction, and also has a particular object, which is the genitals of, or the reproductive organs of a person of the opposite sex. Okay, so as always, or as usual anyway, I'm going to reconstruct Aquinas's argument. As always, I also encourage you, to pause here and try to isolate the different premises and the conclusion to which or toward which Aquinas is driving. But anyway, here is the argument. The first premise is simply that an action is sinful only if it violates the order of reason, right? As we've seen. An action is sinful if it violates the order that was placed there in things by God. That's what makes it sinful. Right? That's what makes it impermissible. Now, the second premise is that an action violates the order of reason only if it fails to respect the good ends for which things are made. Okay? Again, the idea here is God has created certain things, or created all things rather, with a purpose in mind that is good, right? Since he is an all good God. And what it means to respect the order of reason, right? The order of things that is there in the world that we as rational beings are able to perceive, able to grasp, is to respect the good ends for which God made things. Right? So if an action violates those good ends or purposes or functions, those teloses that are out there in the world, if an action violates those, then it's wrong, right? It's immoral, it's sinful. It violates God's law. Whereas, if it doesn't violate that order, if it accords with that order, then it's not sinful. Okay, and so what can you conclude from this? Well, if an action is sinful only if it violates the order of reason, and an action violates the order of reason only if it fails to respect the good ends that things are made for, then, well, if an action respects the good things for which things are made for, it's not sinful. Right? An action that respects the good ends that things were made for is not impermissible. It's not sinful. There's no problem with it. It accords with the order of things that God put, or the order that God put into things. It accords with God's law. To that, Aquinas adds, well, sexual acts that are directed toward reproduction respect the good ends for which things are made. That is the good end for which sexual acts are made. That's the good end for which we have sexual organs in the first place. It's in order to reproduce, which is good. And so a sexual act that is directed toward reproduction respects God's law. It respects the ends for which things are made. And so from this we can conclude sexual acts directed to reproduction are not sinful. So again, Aquinas' question is, are all sexual acts sinful? And his answer is no. Not all of them are sinful. If they're directed to reproduction, right? If you're having sex for the sake and only for the sake of reproduction, then what you're doing is not sinful. Notice, this is a pretty restrictive view of sex. Right? It's only permissible, only morally permissible for you to engage in sex if you're doing it for the sake of reproduction. Okay, I'm going to say a little bit more about this. It's a little bit more complicated than this. But basically, this means if you're using protection, if you're using like condoms or other forms of birth control, what you're doing is morally wrong. Right? What you're doing, according to Aquinas, and actually according to Catholics to this day, right? The Catholic Church still holds this view. What you're doing is morally wrong. Why? Well, because anything that violates the natural order of things is morally wrong. The natural order of things is such that your reproductive organs are for reproduction. And so anything that involves using the sexual organs for anything else than reproduction is morally wrong. Okay, so any form of birth control, even pulling out, right, when the man ejaculates elsewhere than inside a woman, that is morally wrong from the Catholic perspective. for exactly the same reason. Any time where a man's semen ends up outside a woman's vagina, that's morally wrong. That's not what that's for. That's not where that's supposed to end up. So you've got a very restrictive view of sex here, like extremely restrictive. Even within marriage, sex is wrong if it is not for the sake of reproduction, or if it's not at least open to reproduction. Okay, so it's not only that it must be consensual. Of course, it must be consensual, but that's not enough. It's not only that it has to be in a serious relationship. Of course, it has to be in a serious relationship, but that's not enough. It's not only that it has to be in a marriage, right? A serious relationship that is a marriage. Of course, it does, but that's still not enough. It must be with consensual, within a marriage, and for the sake of reproduction, to not be sinful. So you've got in Aquinas a very restrictive view, and in the Catholic tradition in general, to this day, a very restrictive view of when it's okay to act or to engage in sexual activity. You also have, if you read the text carefully, you also have a very pessimistic view of the human sexual impulse. Remember what I called last time, or what Alan Sobel and Raja Halwani call metaphysical sexual optimism, or sorry, pessimism, is just a very pessimistic outlook, right? A very negative outlook on the human sexual impulse. And if you read the text carefully, you'll see Aquinas has a very negative, right, a very pessimistic view of the human sexual impulse. According to Aquinas, the concupiscence, right, feeling sexual desire. Remember, that's what the word concupiscence means when you read Christian authors. Feeling sexual desire, feeling concupiscence, is incompatible with perfect virtue. In other words, if we were perfect, we would never feel sexual desire. We would be immune to concupiscence. The only reason we do feel sexual desire, according to Aquinas, is that we're fallen. Right? Remember, according to the Christian story, human beings were made in order to share in God's presence. That's how we find fulfillment. But through the first sin, which is sometimes represented in the story of Adam and Eve, but not all Christians have thought that was literal. Anyway, through the first sin, we were separated from God. And now we live in a fallen state where we're separated from God, and God has had to, send his son to come and rescue us and all of that. The only reason we feel concupiscence, the only reason we feel sexual desire, is that we're in a fallen state. If we were still in our original state of union with God, according to Aquinas and according to all Catholic authors, we would just not feel sexual desire. Also, Aquinas says that concupiscence is incompatible with understanding. The concupiscence is incompatible with reason. Think about it. When you feel sexual desire, it's overwhelming, and it overwhelms your faculties in such a way that you might act in a way that is wrong, that you might later regret, in a way that is irrational, right? That a rational being that was looking out for its own good, that was trying to live its best life, would not do. Okay? Concupiscence, sexual desire, Aquinas says, overwhelms our reason. It's animalistic, right? It reduces us to the state of animals in some way. In some way, it's incompatible with what we are, right? Rational animals who are made in the image of God in order to share in his goodness. And so what you have here is a very pessimistic view of the human sexual impulse, right? The human sexual impulse, we only have it, we only feel concupiscence, we only feel sexual desire because we're in a fallen state. And in many ways, it interferes with our living the best kind of life. It interferes with our organizing our life rationally. And actually, again, if you read the text carefully, Aquinas says concupiscence is a punishment for original sin. Right? It's part of our punishment for having sinned against God and now being separated from him. In other words, it would be better for us, right? It would be much better for us if we just never felt sexual desire. Our lives would go better, right? We would be better at living a good life, better at uniting with God, better at pursuing our good rationally if we didn't feel sexual desire. Actually, there's a quote from the Christian author C.S. Lewis that might help you. I don't know if you know this, but the author of the Chronicles of Narnia, C.S. Lewis, was also a Christian philosopher. He's written several books, and there's one quote by him where he talks about the sexual impulse, and he says something like, "It's almost ludicrously in excess of its function." Right? We feel sexual desire to a degree that is ludicrously in excess of, from the Christian point of view, the function of the sexual impulse. And from the Christian point of view, from a natural law perspective, the reason we have sexual organs, the reason we have a sexual impulse, is to reproduce. Now, do you only feel sexual desire when it's time for you to reproduce? Think about it. How many times do you need to reproduce in a lifetime in order to fulfill, your basic social obligations as Christians understood it, or as people understood it until recently? Maybe you have to replace yourself, so you reproduce twice. If we're at a stage in history where it would be good for the human population to expand, maybe you reproduce yourself like 4 or 5 times maximum, something like that. Do you only feel sexual desire 4 or 5 times in your entire life? No, right? We usually only feel hunger when we need food. We usually only feel thirst when we need drink. But we don't only feel sexual desire, right? Only have concupiscence when we need to reproduce. We feel sexual desire in degrees that, or in such excess to how much we need to reproduce that it's absolutely ludicrous, C.S. Lewis says. And that's a similar idea, right? Or it's the same idea. It's the idea that if we were perfect, we would not feel sexual desire at all, and we would simply engage in sex out of a rational understanding that, oh, we need to reproduce, we should reproduce, have a couple of kids. Or maybe we would only feel sexual desire to the degree that we needed to reproduce. And then once we'd reproduced enough, 2 kids, maybe 4 kids, 5 kids, I don't know, it would just stop. Right? That's what things would be like if everything was ordered properly. But it's not ordered properly because we live in a fallen state. And so we're now we're now susceptible to concupiscence that interferes with our life and that causes us to do things that are wrong, and so on and so forth. Okay, so that's the Christian perspective here. That's Aquinas' perspective. Okay, so this brings us to the next question. Aquinas' next question, fittingly, is lust always a sin? Again, lust here means not feeling concupiscence, not feeling sexual desire. It means acting on concupiscence, acting on sexual desire. In other words, having or engaging in sexual activities for the sake of sexual pleasure. And here Aquinas answers yes. Okay, lust, engaging in sexual activities for the sake of sexual pleasure, is always sinful. Here's what he says. He says, the more necessary a thing is, the more it behooves one to observe the order of reason in its regard. Therefore, the more sinful it becomes if the order of reason be forsaken. In other words, the more important something is, the more important it is to respect what it's made for, okay? To respect the order of reason in its regard, to respect the order that God has put into nature as far as it's concerned. Right? So the more important something is, the more sinful it is to use it for the wrong purposes. Now, the use of sexual acts, as stated in the foregoing article, right, in what we just read, is most necessary for the common good, namely the preservation of the human race. Right? Using the sexual or the reproductive organs properly, engaging in sexual acts only for the proper purpose, is the most necessary thing for the common good. It is what is most important to the good of humanity, because that's what's required for the preservation of the human race. Okay? Therefore, he says, there is the greatest necessity for observing the order of reason in this matter, so that if anything be done in this connection against the dictate of reason's ordering, it will be a sin. Okay, so because of how important the sexual impulse or the sexual organs are, because they're crucial to the preservation of the human species, using them in the wrong way is very, very bad. Right? It's not just impermissible, it is very, very bad. It is a grave sin, And so we'll see for Aquinas, it means it is a mortal sin, using them for the wrong purpose. Now, he says, lust consists essentially in exceeding the order and mode of reason in the matter of sexual acts. Therefore, without any doubt, lust is a sin. Okay, again, I have to stress, I have to make sure to highlight, by lust here, he does not mean what we usually mean by lust, which is sexual desire. He does not mean that. He's talking about acting on sexual desire. So he's talking about engaging in sexual activity for the sake of sexual pleasure. Right? The sexual impulse or sexual desire or concupiscence is a desire for sexual pleasure. That's what it is. And he's saying acting on concupiscence, acting out of sexual desire, right? Engaging in sexual acts for the sake of sexual pleasure, that always exceeds the order of reason. What does that mean? Well, again, if your sexual faculties were properly ordered, right? If we weren't in this fallen state, Aquinas thinks, and generally speaking, people in the Christian tradition have thought, we wouldn't feel sexual desire, or at least we would only feel it when we needed to reproduce. The way that we only feel hunger when we need to eat to sustain ourselves, or the way we only feel thirst when we need to drink to sustain ourselves. But in our current state, we feel desire in excess of what we need in order to reproduce. And so acting on desire is always acting wrongly, right? If you're having sex for the sake of sexual pleasure and not for the sake of reproduction, you're using your sexual organs for the wrong purpose. Okay, that's what Aquinas thinks. If you're using your sexual organs for pleasure and not for children, you're using them for the wrong purpose. And so acting on sexual desire, acting out of concupiscence, in other words, committing acts of lust, is always using your sexual organs in violation of the order of nature, in violation of God's law. That's what he's saying. And so it's always a sin. So here again is the argument, reconstructed. Aquinas' first premise is the more important something is, the more sinful it is to fail to respect the good ends for which it's made. Right? Again, the idea is there is a telos in every natural thing. And there's an end, a purpose, a goal. And the more important that telos is, the more important that end or purpose or goal is, the more sinful it is to act in violation of it. Now, to this he adds, this is the second premise, the sexual instinct is very, very important. Right? As we've seen, Aquinas says that the purpose of the sexual instinct is to keep the human species alive. And if you take his word for it, that is the most important thing. Okay, so the sexual instinct is of the highest importance within the natural world. Again, God created the world for us in the Christian view. He created it so that we could share in the goodness of the world he's created, and so that we could share in his goodness. So it's very important that we exist, right? It's very important that there still be human beings. And so the sexual instinct, which is the faculty by which we ensure that there are still human beings, is of the utmost importance. Now, taken together, what does this give us? Well, if the more important something is, the more sinful it is to fail to respect its purpose. And if the sexual instinct is very important, if it is indeed the most important thing, then it's going to be very sinful to fail to respect the end of reproduction for which the sexual instinct is made. It's going to be a grave sin. It's going to be, in many cases, a mortal sin. Now, that's part of what Aquinas says in the passage that we just read. What else does he say? Well, he adds this premise. He says, lust, right, acting on concupiscence, acting on sexual desire, consists essentially in failing to respect the good ends for which the sexual instinct is made. Right? When you engage in sexual acts out of a desire for sexual pleasure, you're failing to use your reproductive organs in the right way, Aquinas thinks. You're failing to use them for the sake of reproduction. Right? You're using them for a different purpose. And so, from this, it's going to follow that lust, again, not sexual desire itself, but acting on that sexual desire, is very sinful. Okay, so that's Aquinas' argument in the passage that we just saw. He's saying, given how important the sexual instinct is, it's going to be very sinful to use it for the wrong purposes. And lust, i.e., using your sexual organs for the sake of pleasure, is using them for the wrong purpose. And so it's going to be very sinful. Okay, now I want to be clear. This confuses students. Make sure you take note of it, you understand it. Getting pleasure out of sex is not sinful. Okay, if you have sex for reproduction, right? You engage in sex, you're like, oh, I should reproduce because, I should at least replace myself or something like this. And so you have sex with your partner. You're going to feel pleasure. Of course you are, right? It's going to feel good. And that's not a sin. In fact, that's good, right? God made sex pleasurable from a Catholic perspective, from a Christian perspective, to encourage us to reproduce. And having sex in of itself is not sinful. It's not immoral. It's not impermissible. And feeling pleasure when you have sex is, of course, not sinful. That's inevitable. If you have sex, you're going to feel pleasure. What is sinful is having sex just for the pleasure of it. Okay, where your aim, your goal is not to reproduce, but to get pleasure. That's what's sinful. That's what Aquinas calls acting out of, or that's what Aquinas calls an act of lust. Okay, where it's your desire for pleasure that's causing you to have sex and not your desire for children or your understanding that you should have children. Okay, the pleasure is not in itself sinful. It's acting for the sake of that pleasure that is sinful. Again, Aquinas says exactly the same thing about food, right? He's talking about temperance here. He's talking about the natural virtue of temperance, which is one of the cardinal virtues, which is tempering or moderating your desire for pleasure. Aquinas would say exactly the same thing about food, right? From a Catholic perspective, from a natural law perspective, eating food just for the pleasure of it is sinful. That's not what eating food is for. Eating food is for nutrition. It's for sustenance. Now, of course, when you eat food, if it's good food, you are going to feel pleasure. And that's fine, right? God made it pleasurable for us to eat food in order to encourage us to sustain ourselves. That's why he made the human appetite the way that it is. Right? That's why he made it pleasurable to eat, because it would encourage us to do the right thing and eat when we need it. But if you eat just for the pleasure of it, even though you don't need nutrition, right? If you eat even though you're not hungry, for example, that, Aquinas would say, is sinful. Similarly, it is not sinful to get pleasure from sex. Of course not. What is sinful is having sex just for the pleasure of it, instead of for the purpose for which the sexual faculties were made. Okay, so that's everything I want to tell you for today. Now, next time, I'm going to say a little bit more about Aquinas' understanding of marriage, okay, and how all this stuff about concupiscence, lust, and pleasure relates to why marriage is why marriage is good for human beings, or at least good for human beings in our fallen state. And then after that, we're going to move on finally to our main question for this topic, which is that of sexual perversion. Okay, so it's important to keep in mind, for Aquinas, there's sin, but then there's perversion, which is a subcategory, right? Not everything that's sinful is perverted, but of course, everything that's perverted is sinful. So in the next lecture, we'll talk about this subcategory of sinful behavior, and specifically this subcategory of mortal sin, that is sexual perversion, which again, by definition, means something that is a distortion of nature. Okay, so before we end, as always, here's a quick recap. According to Aquinas, as we've seen, the sexual organs have a function, right? They have a built-in aim or purpose or function, a built-in telos, which is that of reproducing. A sexual act performed for that purpose is not sinful. In contrast, a sexual act that's performed out of concupiscence, and so out of the desire for sexual pleasure, is always sinful. So to have sex for the sake of sexual pleasure instead of for the sake of reproduction, that, according to Aquinas, is always sinful, but it's not always sinful to the same degree, right? So as we've seen, a sexual act that is performed out of a desire for sexual pleasure. So in other words, an act of lust may be a mortal sin, or it may be a venial sin. And that depends on the circumstances under which that act is performed. Now, I've already said a few words about this, but basically, if it's performed within a marriage and subject to a few other restrictions, then it's only a venial sin. Whereas if it's performed outside of a marriage, then it's always a mortal sin. That's what we're going to pick up next time. We'll go over this in more detail. And then, as I said, we'll move on to the concept of sexual perversion. All right, that's it for today. See you next time. Bye.